Very long. My name is Richard Epstein. I've taught at this law school for 38 years. I'm now back for the spring quarter, and we'll be back again next spring quarter. And it's always a great delight to talk about the Chicago best ideas. We now do this virtually every week, so we hope that we're not running out of ideas that qualify for the term best. But my own view about that particular subject is, whenever you want to think about whether or not there's a topic on which it's worthy to either speak or to write today, all you need do is to open up a newspaper and to read one story about some of the particular events that have taken place in Springfield, in Washington, in Massachusetts, or anywhere else across the country. And if there's one topic on which there have been more bad news, I think, than any other, it has been, of course, the healthcare revolution, which is now taking place in the United States in a suitably chaotic fashion. I think it is fair to say, for those of you who haven't lived through the Medicare situation and so forth in 1965, that by the time the dust settles on this reform, unless it is either delayed, watered down, or repealed, that this will surely count as a larger and I think ultimately more traumatic change than we had in the 1965 Johnson-era programs. Now, there is, in fact, I think, a general mantra which explains why it is that this thing is likely to crater, and to do so in very large fashion. And this has to do with the diminishing marginal returns to anything, including increased government regulation. We've had basically in the United States 3 major cycles of regulation that we've lived with for the past 80 years. The first of those comes in the form of the New Deal, and you have many of the legacies of that still very much in place: the National Labor Relations Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the Securities and Exchange Act and so forth. Some of them have modest goods. Some of them, I think, are simply devices to strengthen and to make more permanent in the economy the cartels. We move into a next series of regulations in the 1960s in the Johnson, and then in the 70s in the Nixon administration. And it's a different kind of regulation. A lot of it is transfer stuff. A lot of it is environmental protection stuff, endangered species and so forth. Some of it is actually sensible. Most of it, as usual, is not. And now when you come to the third wave, what happens is, A, you first have to continue to bear the burden of the first 2 levels of regulation. And second, the level of ambition that you have with respect to this particular round of regulation is, in fact, far greater than it has been with the previous 2. And my view is we have now really crossed the point of diminishing returns. The expected cost of this system, if you try to do anything like an accurate accounting of what these measures will bring you, is exceedingly high. The benefits, which I regard as highly, shall we say, evanescent and uncertain, are going to be low. I think the only thing that you can say about this program is it will lead to a kind of an unfortunate mad scramble. There will be a persistent decline in both liberty and prosperity in the United States, in my judgment. The great battle of the next generation is not who's going to be able to get the lion's share of a social gain that's created by a vibrant economy. The real question is, in a time of falling wealth, who is going to bear the brunt of what is going to take place? And generally speaking, when you have fights over prosperity, there's at least a little bit of levity in the air. When you have fights over deprivation, there's no levity in the air, so that the prediction that you would make about how this thing will play out is there will be a level of ugliness and recrimination which nobody really wants to witness. And in case you haven't seen it, the political climate in Washington today seems to be more divided on both sides than it has been in a good long time. It's not just a question of bipartisanship or not. There is a fundamental difference in worldviews which drives everything that we're seeing. What's that fundamental difference, and then how does this all start to play out with respect to the healthcare reforms at the federal and the national level? I think the reform basically is, what is the ultimate measure that we try to use when we talk about social welfare in the United States? I am a dyed-in-the-wool traditional consequentialist Parisian, and that's not a banner which you win a lot of votes on, but let me explain to you at least what it is that I mean, which is, instead of having a principle where you worry about the differences in wealth between one person and another, what you ask about any coercive form of government interaction is whether or not it's capable of generating a Pareto improvement. And what that means is, could you find a way through state intervention to make some people better off and make nobody else worse off? And if so, you tend not, at least to the extent that these differentials in wealth emerge through voluntary market transactions, worry unduly about exactly who happens to get which particular benefit. So long as you're pushing this pie into a larger size, what will happen is competitive forces will erode monopoly profits and will tend to create distributions which are going to be less obnoxious than might appear at first instance. And this is even with respect to the very rich, it's going to happen in exactly the same way. If they have to compete for their returns, they will find that there will be pressure from new entrants into their business, and the free money that all of us aspire to will be available to none of us. And so that's the one vision. How do you keep pushing this thing upward? And if you're trying to look at healthcare, the question that you ask is, what particular vision of the world will then allow you to implement that particular view? And the answer is you start looking first at deregulation. There are many forms of regulation in the United States healthcare system, virtually all of them, in my judgment, unwise. Many of them, in effect, have come in for the most parochial or historical reasons, and all of which should be eliminated. So if you want to start with just a couple of them, the first one would be the question is whether or not we ought to keep the prohibitions on interstate competition with respect to insurance in the individual and in the group markets. And the answer to that question is no, we ought to remove them. What happens in politics is if you're after a more comprehensive system of redistribution, you're willing to go soft on deregulation in this area in order to keep the support of certain insurance companies who have, at least think they have, the benefit of monopoly profits. If you want to look at another element, one of the things that we specialize in the United States is saying if you wish to have a private insurance plan, you are free to do so or not to do so, so long as you meet certain minimum standards called state mandates or federal mandates. To give you an illustration of one recent such mandate, in 2008, at the height of the financial crisis, when they were trying to fix the banks, they managed to get through the Wellstone portion of that legislation, which mandated minimum mental health benefits for all people in the United States in private plans. The effect of these things, in some cases, is to reduce consumer surplus with respect to the plans, because you're adding in something which costs more than it is worth. But the people will keep the plans because their initial surplus is large enough to take that hit. These things technically count as social losses, but they are never recorded in any account which simply looks at the number of uninsured. But occasionally you strike the bottom of the river. And when you start putting on another one of these benefits, the entire package is no longer worth having. And since you can't get rid of that cargo, which is too heavy for the boat, what happens is there is now an increase in the number of individuals who are uninsured. This is not a small phenomenon. Over the last 30 years, the number of people in employer plans probably dropped from about, roughly speaking, 60 to 50%. The numbers really don't matter. The direction is essentially inexorable. And that's because essentially what happened is the boat became overloaded with the mandates and it sunk, putting people back to either the individual or the group, small group market on the one hand, or on various kinds of public programs on the other. These things are reversible. And it seems to me that one of the things that you would want to do is to get more competition in all of these markets, and to do so in a way which would allow you to buy, if this is what you prefer, a lower form of insurance protection for a lesser sum of money. You don't want to sort of predetermine what it is that people need for their own goods. It's not that they're perfect judges of their own character. It's just that they, with their employers, their friends, their church groups, and their agents, will generally do a lot better on this than the United States government, which is, shall we say, governed by a series of individuals whose constitutional and economic wisdom is not, at this point, beyond repair. So the essential logic of the small government Pareto improvement side is figure out pockets of regulation which seem to be removable, get rid of them, cut down state administrative costs, increase the level of private choice, and then just watch as the levels of individuals who are without insurance start to be reduced as the price for these forms of coverage goes down. It turns out, however, that the dominant philosophy in Washington today is, in fact, exactly the opposite. What it says is, we don't worry about Pareto improvements, we worry about elimination of wealth differentials. And understand that this is a very profound difference. So if you believe in the Pareto formula, and you have 10 people at 10, and one of them can now go up to 12 and everybody remains the same, you're really quite happy about that situation because you've seen a net improvement of 2. But if in fact you start to believe in perfect equality as the ultimate drum, then any deviation from that initial distribution, which allows one person to advance more than another, is not to be regarded as a social improvement, but to be regarded as a festering source of social unrest in the form of economic inequality. And there's no question that what's driving many of the people who are in favor of reform is not so much a sense of how we expand the pie, but rather a much more profound sense of why it is that the pie seems to be so skewed in the way in which it distributes its benefits to one group of individuals to another. And so the question then is, can you work a program of redistribution and do so in a way which, generally speaking, will not shrink the size of the pie? The answer to that question is yes and no. The yes part of the question comes, there is no doubt in my mind that certain low levels of persistent government redistribution meet with a high level of popular acceptance, because if you look at the way in which people spend their own money, they may not tithe themselves, but they're always willing to kind of help out through churches and religious groups of one sort or another, hospital drives, various kinds of public service drives, in order to help those who are less fortunate than themselves. But like every other good thing on the face of the earth, too much of a good thing becomes a bad thing, or the marginal cost of additional units of redistribution relative to the benefits that it gets starts to go south. The great danger that I see in the current way in which the healthcare system has worked itself out is that we have now passed the point of optimal redistribution and are very much on the downward side. I think that the resentments that are going to start to take place have already begun to show themselves in a number of areas, and as they accumulate, the basic response on the part of the median voter in the United States is going to be, hard as I work, it turns out that I'm left worse off than I was before because of a series of programs that are designed to basically benefit the opportunist and the profligate at my expense. So, for example, when the president announced his recent misguided program with respect to additional relief with respect to those people who have fallen behind on their mortgage payments, it turned out that the dominant response that came to the White House was from people who have mortgages, have controlled their situation, who saying, why do I want to live in a country which is going to tax me enough so they might throw me into default? What you have to do with respect to these mortgages is to allow the foreclosures, let the property go back into the market at their lower valuations, and start over again without having all of these legacy obligations which are kept unrealized on both the public and the private books. And I think that's exactly the right sentiment to have on these kinds of issues. And as I see matters, we are going to see more of that taking place in this country. With respect to the health care bill, I think the basic prognosis of this situation is already in. And let me explain to you very briefly what it is. There are supposed to be, and I say supposed to be, some 31 million people who will be added with first-class health care who are not otherwise provided for under the system. I regard this as a snare and a delusion. There is not enough money out of the sources of funding that are available to bring those numbers of people on the rolls, and to do so with respect to the set of mandated benefits that are stipulated under this health care bill. You cannot take people who are in bad shape in some cases, okay shape in other cases, and all of a sudden try to turn this market around and give them Cadillac health care at the same time that everything else that they have is at a much lower standard. Nor, in fact, if they got the money, would they choose to spend it in that particular fashion. Generally speaking, most people are intuitively moved towards the equal marginal solution. They want their last dollar spent on health care to give them the same amount of benefit as it gives them on education, as it gives them on food and shelter, as it gives them on recreation and everything else. Exactly how you do that, one doesn't know, but that's not an argument for government mandates. That's an argument for private choices, because it's much easier to make those equal marginal judgments than it is to explain to somebody else how they're made and why they happen to be right for you if it turns out that they're going to be wrong for everybody else. So what's going to happen is, as they try to push the funds into this situation, you're going to find that trying to service this portion of the population is going to be much more expensive than you thought it was, and the only place that that money could come out of is the median voter. It will either come out in terms of higher taxes. There's even talk with the eminence of a man like Paul Volcker that they will take place in the form of a VAT, a value-added tax, which is commonly used in many of the European countries to fund their rather extensive welfare state. It is also clear it's very difficult to make a VAT progressive if your income tax is progressive. So it's going to be essentially a first dollar tax with maybe a little bit of remission in it, but it's going to be a very steep kind of operation. So that's one way in which you're going to start to see the system work, start to implode, and the consequences are going to be further. You can try and do some of these calculations, and this is what you end up on. You're just simply looking at the size and scope of the obligation. Too much has been bit off too soon. You can try and push back on the providers of health care and make them accept less money. If you actually look at the kind of disposition on the part of this group, Collectively, doctors tend to be in favor of Obamacare. Individually, they tend to be thinking of early retirement. Many of these people will leave the profession at age 58 or 62 if, in fact, you get a cut in rates, which will not allow them to cover their rather extensive cost in administering these kinds of programs and meeting their other obligations, including rent and everything else, so that you will see a shortage in the supply of the physicians. You will also see a retreat and a disintegration of all the kinds of private health care plans that are now in place in the United States. The promise that had been made by the administration that if you like your current health care plan, you can keep it, was a metaphysical and not a real promise. The first thing you discover when you looked at the statute is that the definition of a health plan is any health plan is a health plan so long as it's never amended. And every health plan is amended countless times in order to take into account difference in rates, coverage, benefits, formulas, and so forth. All of those things essentially are not going to be given the grandfathered protection. And also, by the time we got to the final iteration of the additional levels of consumer protection were thrown on these plans, these are additional mandates, and by the time you take the cost associated with these particular mandates and the reduced income that's going to be available to workers still working by virtue of higher taxes, many of these plans will turn out to implode, putting people back into a public sector, which we have yet to be able to finance. So you're not going to be able to finance it that way. How do we know? Well, we've already had our early warning signal, and that comes in the form of the legislation or the administrative dispute which is taking place in Massachusetts, which of course is to some extent the so-called Republican model of the National Health Care Plan. And what happened last February was that the governor ordered his insurance commission to basically switch from a notice system to a prior approval system when it starts to evaluate the rate packages that are being put forward by the various kinds of health care plans. For those of you who are not familiar with regulation, the difference between notice on the one hand and approval on the other hand is the only difference that matters in terms of insurance. A notice system is essentially a full disclosure system. Your Pilgrim health care plan, you want to bet people, have to give notice, give it to the commission, then you put it up there, and this is a kind of an anti-consumer fraud, anti-bait and switch kind of operation. But there's complete freedom with respect to the choice of rates that you have, and no administrative hassle, no effort to try to figure out whether or not the rates give you or do not give you a suitable rate of return or anything of the sort. The moment you start moving yourself into an approval system, essentially what you've done is abandon that particular model of disclosure only and are now making independent judgments as to whether or not you think there's been quote-unquote excessive profits in the industry. Now, some of you would say, but this is, of course, something that we always do when we're dealing with regulated industries, and you're right. And you're wrong. It is something that we do when you're talking about regulated industries that have some kind of a monopoly power, typically the kinds of network industries that we talk about dealing with electricity and so forth and power. But it's not the kind of thing that we've ever done in a competitive industry. And the reason you don't do it in a competitive industry is there's no monopoly profits to bleed out if you're already only earning a competitive rate of return. So that what you have to do is to tell people it's got to be less than a competitive rate of return, which immediately gives you serious grounds for constitutional challenges, even under the very weak laws of property protection that exist in other areas. Rate regulation, you still have to worry about this as a serious matter. And so in Massachusetts, and in addition into Maine, that's not the standard. The definition of excessive is no longer whether you're getting a monopoly rate of return, which everybody admits that you are not. The definition of excessive is, are you making the kinds of profits which seem to be inappropriate to a large firm at a time that there are many people who are doing without health care coverage. So it's a sort of share the wealth, share the misery type of operation. Well, they managed to reject 235 out of 274 rate increases that have been proposed and promised to give them only smaller ones in exchange. And the companies now have announced as of yesterday that they don't want to write any health care insurance inside the state because they can't make an appropriate rate of return. The state does not take that lying down, and it announces that it's going to fine you if you try to withdraw. And one of the signs that you know you're heading into deep totalitarian territory is if in fact you've got a competitive industry and exit rights are going to be systematically banned by the state. This will provoke a very complicated set of constitutional challenges because the exit right is very heavily treasured by pretty much anybody who works in a federalism system. But if you actually look for case law which indicates that the right to exit a state, which is subject to regulation, is constitutionally guaranteed, you cannot find anything explicitly. So you're back to much more complicated kinds of takings and due process sorts of litigation. Now, all this stuff takes time, and in the interim, these companies have announced that they're not going to sell anything until the legal position has been clarified. Well, that's just terrific for 800,000 people inside the state who are now relying on non-existent coverage, which they may never be able to get. But on the other hand, there's a grand total of one tiny company with no capacity that's writing in these two markets. So what you've seen already is an early instance of implosion. There is no way that you can make this dance work by announcing to the healthcare insurers that we're squeezing your rates because we know that you can now turn around and squeeze the actual providers, you know, the Harvard healthcare plan and so forth, because they can't make a dime either. So what happens? You've got one of two types of scenarios. Either the companies win and they pull out of the state, at which point you have a real problem of how you supply this because the state is in heavy deficit, or they lose, at which point they go bankrupt in the short run and you now have to face exactly the same problem thereafter. So it's not a funny kind of situation to realize that rock and hard place are the only thing that happened. The ostensible purpose of the Obama plan was that when we start to impose these kinds of rates upon you, you will find magical efficiencies that were nowhere available, and so that the way in which you're going to make your money is to do the kinds of things that only necessity can require you to do. The difficulty with respect to that is we now have had at least 3 decades of fairly powerful documentation of very powerful price differentials that exist in the provision of health care in various locations in the United States. These are the Wenberg studies that started out of Dartmouth in the 70s. And what's amazing about these things are two facts. One is that they just continue to persist. No matter what you say, they just seem to remain there. Nobody can do it. And secondly, you ask people, why do they happen? The same guys who can document the results cannot give you a strong industrial organization explanation as to why. What, that the food? Okay. They can't give you a strong, just pass them up the aisles, okay? They can't give you a strong industrial organization explanation as to why they persist or what ought to be done. So there are all sorts of reasons for these things which may not be amenable. It may be a zoning law in one community prevents competition from coming in, and it has nothing to do with the provision of health care at all. Once you discover that you're in a state of the world in which you have inefficiencies and no particular way to get rid of them, and no particular way to identify them, throwing on a system of price controls is not going to change things in the short run. It's just going to create a greater level of confusion and chaos than you otherwise had. So the prediction that is going to take place, I think, is that everybody will try to scramble. Nobody wants to go out of business under these circumstances, but that some people will succeed. On the other hand, most people, it turns out, will start to fail, which means that you're going to start to put more of the pressure on the public side of this particular program. What does that look like? Well, this is a disaster area already, and the disaster comes in two forms. Part of it comes in the way in which you're trying to structure the so-called insurance exchanges, and the second part of it comes in the way in which you're supposed to try to operate the Medicare and the Medicaid programs that are now in place in the United States. And before I start to take some questions, let me spend about 5 or 7 so minutes talking a little bit about each of them, and then we can kind of open it up to discussion. Well, if you start to look to the private kinds of care, what you do is you find out that the following situation seems to be what the administrative position is. There are very powerful constraints on the way in which any private insurance company that wants to participate in an exchange can operate in terms of what kinds of coverage they can give and whom they can supply and how many people they have to take. So what happens is, in an ordinary market, essentially what underwriting is about is a competition over multiple dimensions. So if you want to be an insurance company, what you can say is, you know, I really am very good at taking care of cancer-type patients. I only want to write cancer-type policies. Or I'm really very good at doing geriatric work, but I'm not very good at doing kids. Or I'm very good at doing women, but not doing men. You can go on and find and slice and dice it. And so what an insurance company does is it basically tailors its population to the group that they can manage best, and then tries to figure out the coverage terms that will be optimal for the proposition that they want to take. And the secret of success in every market that you look at is your ability to move simultaneously on multiple margins so as to get the best mix for you and your customers of the prices that you charge. You want to keep them as low as you can to get people into the system, and the services that you provide. You're trying to maximize that particular difference for profits, and the threat of entry is what makes sure that the customers get something that they actually want. Now, nobody can say that this art is one which always succeeds, but you never want the best to be the enemy of the good. What you can say with a great deal of confidence about all of these kinds of healthcare programs is that they do a pretty good job of mentioning and matching, and they also do a pretty good job of monitoring. It's extremely difficult when you're running healthcare to make sure that physicians are doing the kinds of things that you would like them to do because of all the agency cost problems in this system. That is, a physician is going to be under constant pressure by a patient who's paying a fixed sum to give more and more care. There's going to be a lot of personal loyalties there. But every time you will let things go over the top in that particular dimension, it means that the costs for the rest of the system are going to increase. So you really have to be the Grinch who stole Christmas when you're running these healthcare plans, because you can't keep the long-term viability up if, in fact, every reasonable request for assistance is going to be granted. What you're doing here is not asking the question when you're running a healthcare plan, is the benefit that somebody seeks greater than zero? The answer to that question is almost always yes. The question you have to ask, which is much honored, is the benefit that you're seeking greater than the cost it takes to supply it? And for that question, it takes a lot of difficult calculations. So in order to do these things, what companies then have to do is to develop very accurate internal controls, understand who their physician base is and their patient base is, try to figure out what works here, what works there, and then to tailor the way in which the treatment goes based on aggregate data. This necessarily requires you to take some control out of the hands of physicians, which is why they don't like HMOs, because essentially their status is reduced as global data replaces individual judgment. When you start going to these kind of healthcare plans, these particular mechanisms are not given the slightest bit of respect in the way in which you work. So the first thing that happens is if you want to take somebody in when you go into an exchange, you have to do it more or less on a first-come, first-served basis. You don't have any independent rights to refuse. What happens if you get sort of over-demand, an oversubscription to your program? Well, you've got to reduce it, but you don't have any power to decide whom you keep and whom you get rid of. Somebody has to develop a kind of a randomized program to decide who stays and who goes, which cannot skew you to either higher or lower cost individuals. What that means, in effect, is your ability to get coherent populations by either age, sex, disease condition, location, and so forth is going to be heavily compromised. You're going to be more inefficient. Then you're told, in effect, once you get these people, at least under the Massachusetts plan, you keep them only as long as they want to stay and they can leave, at which point the gaming opportunities become just enormous. People plan that they need to have their knee fixed on a Monday and they'd like to get their shoulder fixed a week from now, so they sign up a month in advance, get the treatment, and then withdraw from the plans. So essentially, if you allow consumer opportunism, you have to figure out how to make up these deficits, and the only way you can do that is through coercive exactions on some other group of individuals. In addition, even for the people who want to stay there, these programs are extremely costly. They don't give you any option with respect to either declining coverage or with respect to charging differential rates for pre-existing conditions. You can do that in a market if you let the market work over multiple years. Some 13 or so years ago, myself and John Cochran, who's in our business school, independently we discovered, hit upon the same idea, which is basically in the good state of the world when you're 25, like you guys and so forth, you go out and you buy two kinds of insurance. One of them is insurance to cover you for the present year, and the other is a different kind of insurance, which will essentially give you bad news coverage in the event that something should go bad in your life. And if you could keep everybody in on these programs, the amount of money that you get on the bad news portion of the premium situation should be able to cover those people with pre-existing conditions. Note what this does is it gives you a strong incentive to come in early rather than the current situation where you wait till you find out what your full state of information is and start to come in late. But it only works if you can make sure that the money that you put in for the bad news state of the world stays with the companies and can be transferred back and forth across insurance. The moment somebody's allowed to withdraw from the program and either refuse to pay those dollars or to get them back if they're previously paid, the whole system will fall to pieces. And to the extent that you have a rate-based system, as we do in the United States, which tends to talk about individual years rather than long-term planning, it has killed off that kind of voluntary program. So at this particular point, then where do you get it? Now, one of the great tragedies of healthcare in the United States is that we have a bipartisan consensus that since healthcare is a right, something which I would never accede to, I think you have the right to purchase cover for healthcare from a voluntary provider, which is a rather different thing, Since it's a right, there's got to be a correlative duty to somebody to supply this to you, as opposed to using these market mechanisms. Now, what do you get from that? Well, obviously, you get more people covered in the short run, but you get a withdrawal of entry into the market on the provider side in the long run, so that conflict does not get resolved. But you also get something else. The voluntary markets, in the way in which I've described them, they're naturally stable. Nobody is going to want to leave an insurance pool by virtue of the fact that somebody else in that pool is a riskier person to cover than they are. Their premium is tailored to their particular group and condition, so the great genius of this system is, doesn't matter whom else this company is insuring, what they will do is give you a number, and if you don't like that number, you could go somewhere else and get different coverage from somebody else. So the things turn out to be stable except for search costs. The moment you start having subsidies for any group in the population, you then have to have cross payments or cross subsidies or general revenues. First thing we note is they don't want to put the cost of this extra coverage on the taxpayer writ large. So they announced that the health care plans can not only have to take people in, but everybody has to join them. So the right to health care becomes a duty to health care. And if you look at the actual numbers, the legislation, I think, talks about a 3-to-1 maximum differential based upon age, when in fact the theoretical difference in most cases is closer to 5-to-1, which means that there's a lot of cross subsidies in there, which mean a lot of young people will try very hard to keep out of these programs because they're better off working on some other system. If you then try to figure out the amount of subsidy that's needed to cover these things, my view is it will not be sufficient unto the day to do it, even if you're willing to give as much as $10,000 or $11,000. And there's a terrible question about how you organize this particular subsidy. If you give a lump sum subsidy to individuals at the bottom, say, hey, you're now such and such an income, such and such a family status, you get $10,000 out of the Treasury, what happens is every marginal dollar comes out of their own pocket. And if it turns out the cost of this program is going to be $16,000, they may choose to forego the subsidy because they cannot afford the $6,000 that it has. If you run it the other way and say, look, we're going to require you only to put in $4,000 at your particular bracket and we'll pay the rest, you cannot rely on private individuals to monitor the situation because you get the classic illustration of an unstable equilibrium in which all of the recipients of insurance will socialize their cost and privatize their gain, which is exactly what the banks were able to do with respect to the implicit guarantees that they received from the government. So you have this fact that the subsidy is too large. And just because you open up an exchange doesn't mean that you're going to find somebody who's going to be able to come for it. So this is going to be, I think, a very serious problem. And how is it going to be resolved? Well, I don't think you could push the employers very much harder. I don't think you could push the providers very much harder. I don't think that you could push the insurers very much harder. There's only one way in which under price control systems that you have like this, that you constrain demand, and that's to let people form queues. And that's what's going to happen in the United States. We will move much more to a Canadian system where this has become legendary. How bad it becomes depends upon basically how long a queue, depends upon how much of an implicit subsidy you need to drag out of people who have very bad sort of healthcare conditions. So all of this stuff, I think, is going to be an enormous amount of pressure on the system at large. Now, you also have the public systems at large. And these are really, again, already in dire straits. Nobody who's looked at Medicare finances over the last 10 years has a debate over everything except one issue. The question is, will we go insolvent in 2018 or 2016 or 2022? Insolvent the program will surely become. If you look at the Medicaid programs, it's more complicated because there's a combination of federal and state funding. But just to take a state which is completely mismanaged, Illinois, for example, the periods for reimbursements on these rather below-cost Medicaid reimbursements are now often in the neighborhood of 9 months to a year. No institution can afford to wait that long without getting interim financing, which is, of course, costly, because it's funny, their suppliers don't want to be paid on a 9-month cycle. Their workers who do today are not happy to get their first wage check in September, and so on down the road. So there is, in fact, already very, very great and substantial pressures on these programs, both on the Medicaid side and on the Medicare side. Now, what's going to happen? Well, on Medicare, the program is we'll squeeze the rich guys by getting rid of some of the subsidies. And, you know, I'm perfectly happy to get rid of some of the subsidies. But the difficulty, of course, is always doing this in transition. And if you have somebody who's 86 years of age in serious health care condition, who is told that X, Y, and Z would be available for such and such in price, Quadrupling the rates is not going to be able to solve this particular problem. So the transition issue with respect to the 30 million or so people who are already on Medicare, it doesn't matter what the number is, it's just huge, is going to be very, very substantial. And with respect to the Medicaid program, you have the situation where the increased mandates are such that what you have to do is to fund a level of coverage which has never been done. There will be some short-term federal money, we think, coming into this, but after about 2013 or so, no one ever remembers which year for which program. I certainly don't. Your states are going to be on their own. They are told, of course, that they're entitled to leave if they don't like this. But you could leave Medicare, but all of your local citizens are going to have to still put money into the federal treasury, which can be spent on other states' Medicare program. So you cannot leave the program and basically internalize all of the resources within the states. And so this means, in effect, that everybody is essentially trapped into a program that no state can afford. So what's going to happen when we sum up this happy prospect? Well, it turns out that if you look at it, the employer groups are generally going to be weighed down, even for the large ones, by the mandates and the minimums, and they will slowly start to dissolve. The small group type situations in the individual market is going to prove quickly to be unsustainable without subsidies, and probably to be unsustainable with it. You then try to push people into the public sector, and we can't handle that because the two programs we're relying upon are antiquated in their internal design, hopelessly so, with respect to both Medicare and Medicaid, and in effect already very much in house. This is going to require revenue. Well, where do you get the revenue from? The states essentially have tapped out. There is no viable program for an increase in taxation which will allow you to meet the demands of these programs unless you fundamentally revise the state type situations, and that means in the state of Illinois taking on union pension funds. You want to do that, be my guest. I'm happy to join you. I don't mind dying on the battle line, as it were, but this will be a ferocious fight. Make no mistake about it. They regard these things as sacrosanct, and under the bizarre labor law that we have in the United States today, everything else in the budget gets cut first because these are contract rights, and everybody knows that contracts are sacred, right? I've taught that myself. The problem is these are contracts which were sweetheart deals with other people's money, and that ought not to make them quite as sacred as they would have been if the guys in the legislature who voted the increases were actually paying for it out of their own pockets. But these are simply disguised multi-period transfer payments from ordinary taxpayers to these particular union pension funds, overpaid by a factor of 2 or 3-fold, and to sort of use the sanctity of contract argument for what is the recipient over time of essentially shareholder and stakeholder and taxpayer theft is, it seems to me, a very grotesque argument. But that's what you're going to have to do. Either you take on vested entitlements, because if you treat those as rigid and simply go looking for alternative funding sources, you will come up short. Now, what kind of political wisdom do we have in Washington to make the hard choices? Answer is pathetically none. I'm not going to even sort of make this partisan. There is not a single Republican who's willing to say, God, we better re-examine the benefit structures under Medicare. Rather, what they do is they treat the one subsidy as an objection to the second, instead of trying to figure out how to rationalize that system. And there's not one Republican who's prepared to try to look at the cross-subsidies involved with the pre-existing conditions and the minimum standard stuff. So these guys get a black eye. Black eye is one thing, but then you get the Democrats, and all of a sudden black eyes start to look very good compared to the other stuff. They really believe they can make it worse. We have a president of the United States who thinks that if he stares at you long enough, all of a sudden billions of dollars will come pouring forth out of your pockets because you have now understand the ineluctable logic of the programs that we have in place. This is the only administration in the history of the world which says the way we reduce the deficits in the United States is to first spend an additional $1 trillion of stated money. But it's not $1 trillion. Anybody who tries to do the accounting realizes that that is probably 1/3 or 1/4 the true estimate of these programs once you get rid of all of the difficulties associated with compressing the benefits into 7 years, running the taxes over 10, assuming huge Medicare cuts that won't realize themselves, global efficiencies in an economy which is being laid low by other forms of regulation. This is all a pipe dream. But there is absolutely no willingness whatsoever to talk about this. I remember this morning I was on a talk show in Iowa with a talk show host who seemed to be in favor of secession from the Union, but well, put that modest kind of problem aside. But he did quote from Max Borkus, and then quote from, he listened to him talk in his halting voice. And I mean, what is it about service in Washington that somebody could be there for 3 or 4 terms and sound like a complete fool? I mean, there is no way that you can run a healthcare program and tell people it's just going to have positive redistribution from the rich to the poor. And that's a good thing because of rising inequalities. The basic rule with respect to mandated benefits is they come out of wages first and everything else second. And this does not seem to be apparent to somebody who's trying to figure out these programs. So if you have this fundamental view of public choice, that every time you state that there's an object that you'd like to achieve, and then you pass a piece of legislation and announce that you've achieved it, you will find yourself making one mistake after another. And so what one really needs to do is to remember a very old libertarian lesson, which can be put in a number of different ways. It can be put, this is the law of unintended consequences. The things that you want to have least are the things that you're likely to have most. Or as the man Frederick Bastiat said in one of his great books, what you're really talking about is the hidden consequences in many cases are more important than those which are available. So the transfer payments are what you see, the changes in output that you see, the changes in political composition, the changes of long-term investment into the United States, the willingness of immigrants to come to a high-tax, low-payback company. All of these things matter as well, and of them you do not hear a single word. Wittgenstein said, and he was right to say it, whereof you know not, thereof you ought to be silent. But that is for somebody who doesn't want to do anything. But if in fact you want to be a politician and you don't know anything about what you're doing, the correct course of action for you is not silence, it's inertia. And unfortunately, that's a quantity in very small supply in Washington today. Thank you.
Just one observation and then my question. First, you started off talking about how because of artificial state boundaries, the market already is competitive in healthcare, and then you went on later and noted that you don't think healthcare companies are deriving improper, non-competitive profits via an industry which is already not competitive. The question is that if you take your assumptions to the conclusion, there's going to be persistent subset of people that never have healthcare. If you have just market provided healthcare, at least 5%, 10%, you're never going to have healthcare. So in that case,
no, never going to be able to afford to pay for it.
Right. So in that case, what would you have us do with that small subset, especially keeping in mind the fact that a lot of the cost of their healthcare is already socialized in the system because they go to the emergency room, and that's then passed off onto other legitimate consumers via.
Okay, these are great questions, and let me give some great answers. If I can. I mean, first of all, the number of people who are going to be persistently unemployed is dependent on what becomes of the average age levels in the United States. The reason you have to be concerned that there's something else going on is that as incomes have risen over the last 30 years, the percentage of people who have health care insurance has gone down, and that can't be explained by inability to pay. It has to be explained by mandates of one sort or another, which drive things up. What's really complicated about this, and I think this is what your question is hinting at, we do have restraints on entry which work for some portion of the market, right? At the same time that we have mandated minimums which work in exactly the opposite direction. And my view about it is I don't know exactly the way in which things will play out if you remove both of them, but I can think of a particular scenario in which systematically they will get worse if they're both removed. So remove all of those things, increase overall levels, and now the percentage of the population that's going to need some kind of an assistance is going to be small. The question is, how do you want to treat that? And I think it's a very fair question. The old answer used to be, and don't poo-poo it, is that you'd like to have some degree of charitable service associated with people who are in need. The reason I say don't poo-poo it is we've had many years in the United States before the 1930s where, in fact, there was only charitable care, either by institutions, churches, or doctors, to do that. And you know what happened is very few people went absolutely without care. It's not that you had charity in an obvious sense. You had, shall we say, resourceful forms of price discrimination. It's going down to zero. Sometimes I can't pay a doctor, but I can clean out your sewer. Is that going to be okay? Barter contracts of one form or another. A lot of ingenuity, all of which essentially is driven out whenever you have a form that you have to fill out and bureaucratic approval. And so I'd like to go back to that informal market much more than we do. But that's not going to solve the problem, and to say that is kind of wishful idealism. But as I said to you, I don't like cross-subsidies. And the reason I don't like cross-subsidies is they are disguised and they are not easily accountable for. So that there is nobody who can tell you what the transfer payments and the welfare losses are going to be of the elaborate cross-subsidies in this system. What I think you ought to do is to have a subsidy, if you want it, as a public subsidy. Figure out exactly what somebody's income level is, say how much money you're prepared to give to those people for dedicated health care expenses of a particular variety. Let them take that, augment it as much or as little as they will with their funds, and go to that situation, and interfere as little as possible with anything else. So this means you worry about pre-existing conditions in the insurance market, you're worried about it for these people. If you think that you need a different system, then just as with special ed parents, you may give them larger subsidies, so it is you may give larger subsidies here. But the key feature about every system of subsidy, if it is not on the balance sheet, there will not be any democratic deliberation with respect to it. In fact, one of the things that's so appalling about the health care bill is that its final features, of course, were all hammered out in secret, and there were major new components, including taxes on investment income to fund Medicare, which never received a hearing or a discussion of anything else. This is what happens. When you want to use cross-subsidies, you're trying to disguise things. The moment you're trying to disguise things, all standard deliberative processes have to be suppressed, because the moment people actually understand what's going on, they may actually rise up and oppose it. And so I'm opposed on both kinds of grounds. Do I think we can do this in a country of our size? As I said before, I'm not taking the position that everybody here is adamantly opposed to redistribution. I said exactly the opposite. There is a certain level of which people are quite comfortable with it. But you've got to stay within that sweet spot. And you're not going to be able to do so if most of the redistribution comes in covert forms, so that people just get massive anxieties and therefore start to clam up on the private side. Okay? That would be the answer. Next question from somebody else? Somebody? Oh, I'm willing to take. Come on, what a bunch. Yes, thank you, Medea.
Okay, so I have a question regarding your sort of two-scenario dual healthcare thing, by the good scenario and the bad scenario thing. And you suggested that as a young person, at about 25, you should buy these two kinds. 25-year-olds aren't exactly known for the foresight in predicting their future health conditions. How do you propose you give enough incentive for that to actually happen?
What you do is you say, if you don't want to play in this game when you're 25, we're not going to give you any subsidy when you're 30. And this is the same bunch of students and people who can't figure this out. Many people at 25 are married with children, have had jobs for several years, and those who are still in school, my God, if they can't figure this out, how in the world do you decide which law firm to go to when you're estimating the chances of getting partnership 7 years down the road? I mean, or 10 years down the road these days. Let's be more candid about it. I think what really happens is you don't want competence and interest to be treated as an exogenous and fixed variable. What happens is we change the incentive structure so that now it pays you to actually figure out what your life should look like. You will do it. If we tell you, make whatever blunder you want today because we're going to pick you up tomorrow, you'll be very smart, do absolutely nothing by way of foreplanning because you could externalize the cost on everything else. When I heard a panel in New York about the banking crisis, I don't know whether it's a privilege or a misfortune, but it's certainly an experience to listen to Eliot Spitzer try to rejuvenate his reputation. And old Mr. Spitzer was taken off against the banks on this panel, and you could see the indignation rising as he says that the problem about markets is these people are always in favor of the socialization of losses and the privatization of gains. There's not a single marketeer who's in favor of that. And exactly that's the program that we see going on today. And if you're not required to buy that bad state insurance at the front end, that's what you're going to be doing, socializing losses and keeping gains. And you know what? You'll feel very good about it. And 98% of you who win will feel very good about it. It's the rest of us, when we start having to pay this thing out through taxes in one form or another, are going to feel not so good about it. And in fact, one of the ways to think about this is the same degree of suspicion that you have with respect to producers who are always willing to play the public choice game, and there are many who are. God knows that. Remember, John Q. Public is the same way. One of the hardest things about going into a room like this is everybody here says, I'm virtuous. And when you start talking public choice, everybody says, well, I would never do a thing like that. And then you look around at the numbers in Massachusetts and you say to yourself, if nobody would ever do a thing like that, how come it happens as often as it does? Because the answer is when you leave the room and you go home and your aunt says to you, you know, you're eligible to get this insurance, so why in the world should I take my savings to pay for your knee operation? All of a sudden, the private pressures change the nature of the dynamic. And, you know, all you need to do to become a little bit more conservative on this is to have just a modest acceptance in the nature of human beings as being afflicted by a form of original sin, right? And once you understand that each of us is corruptible, each in our own distinctive way, to a greater degree or a lesser degree, you don't start planning legal rules for saints. I mean, the great sentence in Federalist 10 is enlightened statesmen may not always be at the helm, right? Meaning you build your governments and institutions to deal for bad people. Boy, was that statement ever true, right? Right now, enlightened people are not sitting at the helm, they're not the helmsman, they're not the first mate, they're not down anywhere in the coal carrier section. They're just nowhere on this boat. And we don't have a set of institutions that's sufficient to stop it, because what we're doing is we are heading full speed ahead in the wrong direction. I mean, look, the federal deficit will increase long term by about 1/3 in 14 months. We are already basically, in terms of our financial position, about where Greece was 6 months ago. Right? I mean, we don't meet any of the standard guidelines for EC kinds of compliance. I mean, this is a serious problem you're facing. And you can print money, but you can't get foreign creditors to be thrilled about doing it. George, you don't have anything to say.
Can you explain to us why people are deluded as to the effectiveness, usefulness, decency of healthcare systems, comprehensive healthcare systems all over Western Europe?
Oh, I mean, they are deluded, of course. And they kind of know it in one sense. Well, first of all, the delusion there may be a little bit less than the delusion is here, because they have a very different kind of healthcare system. I mean, the American system is vastly inferior to the Canadian system in terms of its ability to deal with a whole variety of sort of overconsumption use. And in the European system, the way in which they operate it, they're not using the American system. So whatever delusions they have are based on a different problem. So for example, in the English system, much of the compensation done for physicians is done on a per capita basis, right? You get so many people on your rolls, you get so much money for them. The systematic impact of that form of compensation is to underprovide medical care for your people, because you're going to have to service them at zero marginal cost to yourself. That's not the way it works in the United States. What we will do is take the overconsumption model on Medicare and try to generalize it without tamping down eventually on Medicare benefits. So all of these other systems, to some extent, are not quite as crazy as we are. Second element is that they are also, at least they were, and things are changing, of course, with migration patterns in Europe, they were much more homogenous and much smaller, which means that the sense of impersonalization, therefore why not rip off the sons of guns, is weaker in those systems than it is in the United States. You'll note that the places where it really works well are places like Denmark and Sweden and so forth, relatively small countries, highly ethnically homogeneous, everybody's a relative of everybody else. Scale problems in management are much less acute than they are in the United States. They don't have the federalism feature, which completely gunks up the system. If you see the number of state-federal interactions that take place, for example, on rate reviews, it's simply transcendental. So what I would say is I don't think they're being completely delusional. All right, the third thing is I do think that there is another problem which does explain the delusion here and everywhere. We're academics, at least I like to think of myself as that. What's my job? It's essentially to listen to what Bastiat said and to try to figure out as best as I can what the unexamined, hidden consequences are going to be of various kinds of public acts. And the way in which most people make their decisions out of evolutionary pressures is not through pure cognition. I always tell this story about myself, and I'll tell it again. I was sitting one day trying to explain the sort of utilitarian rationalizations for one or another rules to an English professor at some Liberty Fund meeting, so he wasn't particularly hostile. And this is what he said as I started to talk. He's listened to me and he said, "I've heard you. I think I've understood a little of what you said, but not everything. But I do know one thing for sure. If you give that explanation in public, I think if I took the tape, I could get you civilly committed in any state in the United States." That's what he said. And the point was actually true. And the reason it was true on this point was that the kind of utilitarian jargon, economic calculus that you have to use is not there. Most people, when you come up to them, they don't want to hear about marginal cost. They don't even know what the phrase means. They don't want to hear about agency cost or whatever it is. So that the language you need to describe this in ordinary terms is very difficult, and there's a great deal of slippage because the adverse consequences are not felt directly like they are when you simply take in your paycheck and spend all your money by Thursday and are hungry by Friday. These are much more indirect and much more complicated to trace down. And if the story I've given is correct, it's quite clear why people will miss them over and over again. Because, George, I mean, he'll give you another illustration. How many people really think rent control works or price control works, right? But essentially, what you have in this bill is a very complicated indirect system of price controls, which will eventually crater. I don't know why. I mean, that's why I give these talks, on the hope that my job is to sort of, like a psychiatrist, raise all of these elements out of your unconscious, right? And put them front and center. And here's the way in which I do it. This is the way I try to describe program. Whenever you as a politician are speaking before an interest group, you know, the miners, the farmers, the bankers, and so forth, but you have to imagine in the back of the room, there is this large gallery filled with people on the opposite side of every one of their transactions. And what you have to be content that when you say something to please the front rows, that you will not create chaos in the galleries. If you do that, you're going to be doing much better. And if you don't do that, you're going to get this endless succession of private deals, each of which gives a short-term advantage to a group. And yet when you sum all deals over all peoples, everybody comes out a loser. Prisoner's dilemma again. Yeah?
Could the administration have gotten through Congress one of the better, what you consider better European approach?
No. There's a serious path dependency problem, which they have to face. The first thing about it is that you have to worry about the high level of benefits, the excessive level of benefits under Medicare, so that you now have two-tiered insurance and health care payment in the United States, and it's much more difficult to try to introduce a comprehensive program which is going to tamper down the politically most influential segment of the populace than it is to start a program which has nothing in place and build everybody up roughly equally. So I think that thing is there. Secondly, it's like everything else. Once you start putting up a set of institutions with protective barriers, special subsidies, and so forth, interest groups start to coalesce around those things. And now when you start to change it, what you're always told is, hey, this is a vested right. After all, for 30 years and so, this is the way we've done business. We've made major capital investments on the strength of these promises. You can't do us in. So your degrees of freedom that you have, no matter what you want to do, are in fact very, very limited. The advantage of what I'm trying to do is to sort of have new entry barriers removed, old entry barriers removed, so you don't have to dismantle current institutions. You just have to watch them wither. So, for example, I mean, you take somebody like Troy Brennan. You know, he used to be in public health at Harvard, and he signed all those crazy letters talking about more oversight of this, that, and the other thing. Now he's trying to put up a set of private pharmacies. I think it's for CVS. Don't see him signing those things anymore. Because what's happening is this is a guy who wants to get the business out of the emergency room by having 24/7 service where you come in, you know, with nothing but a number, a social security number. You type it in, they can get up your medical records, and for $30 they can treat you or refer you to a place if you really need treatment. And at no wait. That's what we need to have. And at that point, the emergency room backout problem or backlog problem will be, I think, effectively dealt with. I mean, the key feature in many cases is to get organizational skills. The same guys at Walmart, whom I greatly admire, for the camera, greatly admire, will do a far better job of giving you medical care than the administration or the AMA. And what you want to do is to empower them. And you don't empower them every time they try to open up a business. You have a zoning blockade and a union protest with respect to the way it's done. So you can't liberalize, this is the difficulty, the healthcare system, unless you liberalize other segments of the economy around them. And we are so comfortable with these sort of, you know, established patterns. Neighbors now own property to the extent that they can veto new development. That seems to be certainly the Hyde Park expectation, as everybody in this room who's lived here for more than a year or two will know, but it's also much more widely general. Well, you can't run a system in which everybody can veto everybody else's actions and hope to have new entry. And that's the situation that we're finding ourselves in. And it's no joke. I mean, the real problems with labor unions, and there are many of them, are often the way in which they mess up zoning rules, often the way they messed up procurement rules for government contracts, the way in which they interfere with trade negotiations, the messes they create in the environmental area. Because if you've got a monopoly and you can't win something at the bargaining table, your dominant strategy is to figure out a way to exclude the entries by your non-union rivals, your foreign goods, your Walmarts, and so forth. And that's the least social form of behavior that you can invent. So if you want to figure out structurally how you do this, the only way to do it is to get free entry from alien people into conventional markets. If the only thing you're prepared to do is to tell the guys who've been doing this forever how to, oh, please do it better, you're going to fail. This is a case in which we have a geriatric medical profession, including its youngest members. When I teach in the medical school, the brightest, the best, I'm always amazed about the fact that none of them know what expected cost means. They couldn't define it for you, or marginal cost, or figure out what game theory approaches would be. They just don't know these terms. They're not taught that. And so they have all the wrong set of instincts. It's a real institutional failure. We trust much too much the doctors and politicians to do things that decentralized authority should take over. We have time for one more question. Yes, my dear. Yes. Okay.
If more and more people are going to be locked into insurance plans, do you see this as prohibiting the expansion of something like your friend's plan at CVS or Walmart or any other clinics or
No.
prescriptions by
First of all,
how can we incentivize more of that?
let me say, you use the word lock-in in potentially ambiguous way. If it's the government that's locking them into a plan, God knows what will happen. But if it's an employer that's locking them into a plan, all it does is it changes the locus of contracting. So the employer says what you have to do is you have to come with us, and then when it tries to find a low contract solution, what it does is it contracts en masse with CVS in order to have certain kinds of facilities opened up to its employees, and you start to get the innovation coming in that particular direction.